Hi, my name is Aaron Smith. I'm a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, and I'm joined today by Onkar Ghate, Senior Fellow and Chief Content Officer also at the Ayn Rand Institute. And we're here to talk about, this is one in a continuing series of webinars on Ayn Rand's Ford Hall Forum talks. So talks she gave in the 60s and tipping in the 70s at Boston's Ford Hall Forum. And what we're trying to do is highlight some of the themes and issues that come up in those talks and their relevance to today's culture. In this talk, our cultural value deprivation, Rand is addressing aspects of the state of the culture and where one can seek values, where one can find values, and what it means when there is a serious lack of values, offered in the various ranges of things in the culture, such as politics and philosophy and art. And Onkar, do you want to open it up with the way she's coming at these issues?
Yeah, so I find this talk one of the most interesting of this series of Ford Hall Forum talks. I find all of them interesting, but this one is one of the most philosophical, I think. And you really get a sense of how she looks at a culture, just sort of what its crucial features and aspects are, or at least an aspect of it. Because she says, I'm deliberately narrowing my focus to the issue of values, that there's a wider issue going on. She puts it as conceptual deprivation, and then says, that's too large a subject. I'm going to focus on the issue of value deprivation. So we're getting an aspect only of how she looks at and thinks about a culture and the present kind of US/Western culture. But you also get the way in which her philosophy for her serves as a lens through which she looks at the world. I mean, this is a Ford Hall Forum talk, and you get major philosophical issues that come up about the nature of consciousness, and in particular about the nature of free will, and then the role that values play within a consciousness, the role of morality, and how you can start to lose your interest in or grips on the issue of values, and particularly moral values. So it's a very philosophical perspective on the culture. And it's just interesting in the way she thinks about philosophical issues. I was reading, so that there's the essay from Time magazine that she brings up in this talk about the state of philosophy. And it's about how philosophy today has nothing to say about the world or about reality, about people's day-to-day issues and existence. And her perspective, what you get here, is so dramatically the reverse, that you get key points about her view of free will and about consciousness and about values, but not in a theoretical work that's written for 5 fellow philosophers. You get it, these deep points about her philosophy in the midst of her commenting on some cultural issues and some issues that she thinks everyone today, so today means in the 60s, is facing, many of whom are unaware that they're subject to a real problem, or in this case, a deprivation. They're not even aware of it, and that's part of what I think she's trying to do in the talk, is to make people aware of this phenomenon that she thinks is a real and detrimental phenomenon that people aren't even aware of. And then there's, and we can talk about this at the end, I think, there's practical advice that is at least implicit in the talk about what to do in light of such a deprivation that she thinks is going on. And we'll talk about some of the details of what that deprivation looks like. But so I find it very interesting from that perspective. It's very philosophical.
And then you mentioned the thing about philosophers, like the thing coming up in that Time magazine article about people commenting on philosophers. This is in the 60s. You've gotten to the point where they don't really have anything to say. There's a lot of linguistic analysts talking to each other in academic journals and so on. and then also people turning a little bit toward more like the existentialism side, because at least they seem to address some aspects of life and angst and death and just frustration and anxiety and the things that people are concerned with, and they move toward that. But what you get in the essence is an anti-reason kind of emotionalism trend. But looking to today, I noticed that just in the recent years, there's been a movement in academic philosophy dealing with what they call public philosophy, and they're starting to realize there's a real need for something called public philosophy, and people actually out there talking about things in the world where academic philosophers are actually doing work, thinking about that, and engaging with public issues, not outside academic journals. And I remember reading something. I think it was a publication of the APA that a statement formally recognizing the importance of public philosophy. And to an objectivist, that seems like an odd thing. It's like, what else would you do? But then I think the idea was, when it comes to things like tenure track decisions and things, that if they didn't regard, there was a concern that it wouldn't be taken seriously. Oh, you're just doing well, okay, that's not serious. Serious work is where you do specialist work for other academics in peer-reviewed journals and things. And so they were trying to say, look, we want to try to emphasize that we also think that this should be important in thinking about a philosopher's activity, even if it's not in journals. And the idea that this is coming up now is like news.
Yeah, and I think it will be worth talking about. I mean, to come back to this about the current state of things, how much of what she's describing is still applicable today and how much isn't. And one interesting thing is about the field of philosophy. Has it changed from when she's writing? But the kind of thing you're bringing up, and I had that as a graduate student, I could see that there still is at least a suspicion of people who are writing for the public. In my graduate department, I had a philosopher. He was actually my MA advisor, who was writing a weekly column for, this was in Canada, so it's basically the equivalent of the New York Times, the Canadian Globe and Mail. And it was sort of, it's sort of amusing that he writes a column for the general public. But yeah, that's not serious. It's part of the attitude and sort of part of the vibe. So not always directly expressed, but you could tell that was the majority attitude of it. So it's an interesting question to see talk about how much of that attitude still prevails. But I think we should talk first about just some of the things she's bringing up, what she's saying about life in the 60s, before asking then, is it similar to today, different, and in what aspects similar and different? And I think one of the most important points that comes up here is her whole perspective on consciousness. So for those who are relatively new to Ayn Rand, she has her most theoretical work, I would say, is Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, where she's outlining the essence and core of objectivism's approach to the theory of knowledge, to how man, as a conceptual being, acquires knowledge. What are concepts? How are they formed? How do they put us into contact with reality? That's the focus of that. But in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, she emphasizes the perspective that you have to have on the mind or on consciousness if you're to do epistemology properly. And that's that you have to think of the mind or of consciousness as an activity or process, that it is engaged with the world, it brings in data, which it then acts on and processes. And her view of concept formation is the process by which the mind forms concepts like table, chair, man, philosophy, and so on. But she thinks in general that to understand consciousness and the mind, you have to understand it as a process and as an activity. And how the essay opens about this experiment in psychology of sensory deprivation, you're put in, and there's various ways that they now do sensory deprivation experiments, but you're put in an artificial environment in which you get very little data coming in through the senses. You might be submerged in water or in a pitch black room. You don't get any visual stimulation. And the effect that that has on consciousness, because it's a process or an activity that now there's nothing to process, there's no activity that can go on because you're being deprived of this. And she thinks this is a fundamental point about understanding yourself, your own mind, and consciousness, and that there's a similar phenomenon of sensory deprivation, of the parallel, the comparison is conceptual deprivation, that you're not exposed to real ideas, principles, arguments that you really engage in. And then she's saying, well, I'm narrowing this to just look at the issue of values. But you get sort of in this talk, some of the cash value of thinking of consciousness in this terms, and then of looking at things that undermine the proper functioning of your mind, and that you might not even be aware of it. So I think one of the things that she's emphasizing here is this is a gradual withering, that it's not like some scientist picks you up out of your normal day-to-day existence and puts you in a sensory deprivation room. It's a slow suffocation that you get, that you're being deprived little by little. And she makes, in terms of culture, she makes this point, which many people make about Western culture pre-World War I, that you have no idea what it was like, the level of discourse, the intellectual level, and the moral seriousness involved, even when there's conflicts and disputes, but that there were real issues, important issues that were discussed openly and in the newspapers. And so you get a sense of this, for instance, anyone who's watched Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War. One of the things people remark is how articulate these letters from just I'm sure he picked the better letters, but letters from soldiers in the field, of how intellectual and articulate they are. And that's like one glimpse into the 19th century culture. But I mean, if you look at the arts, there's just, it's hard, I think, unless you've read some stuff from the 19th century, to get how different it was. And it's part of what there's a theme running through many of her essays, that there's a slow suffocation here that you don't even notice because it's gradual.
Yeah, and the point she made about it's kind of like carbon monoxide poisoning. You know, you don't know you're breathing in the fumes because you're not aware of it. So I think many people reading this essay, it's kind of hard to process because you don't really you don't have as much access or familiarity with a world where things are a lot different than that. You went to Florence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the idea of going into the piazza and there's just art, sculpture, architecture. You seem to be like surrounded with art, and it's yeah. And she said it's hard to communicate to people who don't have access to that time. But you read things like Thomas Jefferson's letters or things like that. You go back and they're articulate, they're intellectual.
Yeah, and it's the same if you go, think of one of your specialties, the ancient Greek philosophy. If you just think of what 5th century BC Athens was like, and the level of discourse that is going on, and from philosophy to the other sciences, to arts, from the plays, the poems, and if you try to really project what is it like to be immersed in that, it's very, very different.
I actually can't imagine it. That's part of the sadness of this. I can't actually project that. So when you read, Aeschylus and Euripides, and you read Homer, and you actually, now I've been to Greece and to Athens, and it's whatever's left of it. In terms of that, it's just amazing what they have to offer. But it's even the comedies are intellectual. They're a little frat boy too, but they're mixed with this. They're dealing with intellectual themes and things going on in the culture. I can't imagine it.
Yeah,
what it's like to live in a culture like that.
Yeah, you get glimpses of it through what's remained.
Yeah. And if you read a lot of stuff, like you read a lot of 19th century literature, you kind of swim in that. I mean, that's part of the thing is that when I was reading this piece, I was thinking, well, she asks, where in today's culture can man find any values or any meaningful pleasure? And, part of you think it's like, well, where do I look? Like in today, and generally to the past. And that's, you can read Shakespeare, you can read Dostoevsky, or you can read Victor Hugo, or you can go back to other writers in the past. And same with art. Like you and I today can find great art. You go to a museum, but it's old art. It's art that was done long, long time ago. But if you think about like art now, like contemporary art, and you go to a contemporary art museum, I mean, you get just the kinds of things she talks about in this article. And there are studios here and there that are doing different kinds of things, representational art, things that are more, well, that have content. But really, that whole field looks like kind of a wasteland today, or worse. But.
And this is one of the issues that comes up in the Time essay on philosophy. She doesn't quote this or bring this up, but I think it's significant in thinking about these issues, both thinking in the 60s and then thinking, if we're comparing to today, you can ask, so what's asked in this Time essay on does philosophy have anything to say to man, not to does a philosopher have anything to say to his five fellow specialists in some little area, but do they have anything really important to say? And the author or authors, it's not a signed piece, say, if you go back a generation or two, there's philosophers who are part of the culture in the sense that anyone who are at a certain intellectual level, so it's not as could the man on the street name a philosopher, or like in evening news, local news when they go around interviewing. Not could that, but could the person who today you might think of as reading the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, could they name a philosopher? And the point he makes is a generation or two they could name someone like a John Dewey, and everyone would have heard of him and known some of his theories. And who is there now? This is an essay in the 1966. Who is there today that anyone would name? And in thinking of, and it's like is there anybody? It's a sort of rhetorical question. And if you fast forward to today, there's a similar kind. If you ask, who could a person name today as a well-known philosopher who is part of sort of the cultural debate, whose views you might not agree with them, but you should know something about them and take them seriously. Now, Ayn Rand has a certain standing, but certainly not like that, not still yet part of the cultural mainstream. And she's not, I mean, she's also dead 50, or 40 years ago. Who is there like that? And you were bringing it up in the arts. Both you and I like classical music. You can think sort of in the first half of the 20th century, someone like an Aaron Copland, a Sibelius, a Vaughan Williams will be known, again, in the more cultural intellectuals. Who is there today that is known and who has even that kind of stature? And it's, in thinking about those, it's just interesting to think how much of what she's saying applies today, but also the level of slow suffocation that goes on. Because I think she would think of classical music at the time as, like, this is nothing compared to if you go late 19th century, you have Tchaikovsky, you have Rachmaninoff, the whole list, Brahms, and now we've got almost nothing. But now I look back and think, well, the first half of the 20th century is better than the second half of the 20th century. And like I can have some idea of what it was like in the first half of the 20th century. And even someone like a Heifetz, some of the performers would be known, I think, culturally again. Whereas who's known today? Maybe Yo-Yo Ma or something like that. So you can see a distance from, I think, the first half of the 20th century to now in some of these fields. at least. And that's the kind of process I think that she's talking about. And you don't really notice it unless you take that look across decades, not sort of year to year. It's like when you meet someone who you haven't seen for 10 years, you notice changes that you might not really register if you're dealing with them every day. And that's the perspective that you need to have, I think, in thinking about the issues that she's bringing up.
You think about the musical scene too. I mean, in Rachmaninoff's time, he was already regarded as a bit, he's a bit one of these old people clinging to the sort of romantic style and just outdated, and he had to kind of fight against that a bit. So things are already changing very much in the classical music scene, and people are starting to go atonal and more theoretical about the music. But again, now, I mean, when it I'm not exactly having my fingers on the pulse of the nation when it comes to the things about some of the current orchestral music, but I think that a lot of people that are interested in doing that kind of work will either turn to more directly commercial things like soundtracks. They do soundtracks for film and things like that, or heck, even video game music. I mean, people turn to like wanting to do interesting kind of music that's the orchestral style. They go to that because maybe there's just no money at the concert hall. I don't know, but it's I know that when I go to orchestral concerts and stuff, and they usually have every once in a while in the program they'll try to fill in a premiere, for some new work. That's always a turn off for me because I know it's going to be bad. I mean, maybe pessimistic, but every time I hear that, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of thing, is that one of the things she says is your expectations lower. It's like you don't, oh, there's a premiere. Oh, wow, like I wonder what's going to be there. I want to go visit. But new music. When's the last time you listened to new music? I mean, I just listen to old music because it's like I mean, pop is a little different, but
right.
Like I listen to old music when you want like a serious, something, real serious kind of values being projected, and just as some kind of sense, I wouldn't think to even look at anything today. And so you don't actually turn on the radio waiting for some new work that you might hear, oh, I never heard that old piece by Tchaikovsky. I didn't know he wrote that or something. But and that's part of the thing, is your expectations lower. It's like, what's the point of turning on the TV is the feeling. Yeah, I can flip to the channels, I guess, but you don't have expectations. And that's why when you latch onto a show that turns out like it's good, it's such a, like, that's when you feel like you're gasping for air a little bit. And
I want to highlight, so I brought up one of the issues, the philosophical issues that came up in the essay and that or in the talk, and that pay a lot of thinking, just to hit a couple of others. So she talks about free will here, and but she makes a point that you don't find in all of her discussions of free will. It's a point, I think it's part of the theory, but it comes up here because it's particularly relevant here. But it's important for understanding her view of that we have the power of choice, that we have free will. We're not determined by our environment or our physiology or anything like that. It doesn't decide, we decide. Nevertheless, an environment has real ramifications on you that you should be really concerned about, and you might not notice its influence. So that's another, I've been making this point that we've been talking about this point, that it's a gradual process, or a gradual deprivation in the sense that she thinks is going on, a shrinking of your range, of your expectations, of the issues you're concerned about. That you don't notice it doesn't make it unreal. And she thinks it has an effect, including on the choices people make. So, and this is I mean, this is now from the essay, but this is from the talk. There's, I don't know if I noticed any word, or maybe there was one or two word changes from the essay, which is reprinted in the Voice of Reason to the talk that was given at Fort Hall Forum. And this is what she writes, or this is what she said. The choice, quote, the choice to think or not is volitional. If an individual's choice is predominantly negative, The result is his self-arrested mental development, a self-made cognitive malnutrition, a stagnant, eroded, impoverished, anxiety-ridden inner life. A social environment can neither force a man to think nor to prevent him from thinking. But a social environment can offer incentives or impediments. It can make the existence of one's rational faculty, it can make the exercise of one's rational faculty easier or harder. It can encourage thinking and penalize evasion, or vice versa. Today, our social environment is ruled by evasion, by entrenched, institutionalized evasion, while reason is an outcast and almost an outlaw. Close quote. And that's a very important perspective, I think, to have, to think about volition, both in yourself and the choices you face, and the incentives and the impediments, and the ramifications that has on you. And then in terms of thinking about the culture, it has important ramifications. If you think the first webinar that we did a combination of two of these Ford Hall Forum talks, Apollo and Dionysus and the anti-industrial revolution. And if you take this last line first, our social environment is ruled by evasion, and skipping a little bit, while reason is an outcast and almost an outlaw. Part of if you think of those two essays, it's that point from a different perspective, that the moon landing represents reason, and it's poo-pooed, dismissed. They put their pants on one leg at a time, just like everybody else. There's an undercutting of the whole thing. And then there's the real extolling as vanguards, as important, as rebels of the hippies, who she thinks this is a complete joke. But if you think, does that kind of culture that's doing this, that's trying to put feet of clay on this enormous achievement, and of people who are literally living in the muck, trying to put them on a pedestal, does that encourage people to think, or does that encourage them to evade, give up, become cynical? And you can't just say, well, everybody has free will, so that doesn't have any effect. They make the choices, whatever choice that they're going to make. This has no effect, no repercussions. That's not the right way to look at the culture, and it's one of the reasons to be really concerned about cultural trends. They push people to be better, or they push them to be worse. It doesn't determine them, but you have to think of what it's doing to people, positively and negatively. And this is an important point for getting her whole view of free will.
And the point she makes too about you mentioned cynicism, cynicism. It's easy to be cynical about the culture, but one of the things that cynicism engenders is a kind of passivity. Like, what's the point?
Right.
Like, yeah, okay, you could make some better art, but I mean, what's the point? No one's going to want to look at it. Yeah, I guess I could have certain. I could try to take a better stab at what's going on in philosophy, but you won't find a job. And it's like, so a lot of these things have a deterrent or a deflating effect, which isn't. You don't even need to deny free will. You need to unmotivate or demotivate people from pursuing or seeking values, and then that has an effect of like cutting off their motor. And yeah, she says also in the essay, she says man's values control his subconscious emotional mechanism, which functions like a computer, adding up his desires, his experiences, his fulfillments, his frustrations, like a sensitive guardian watching and constantly assessing his relation to reality. The key question to which this computer is programmed to answer is, what is possible to me? And that question about what is possible, it has a lot to do with motivation and what you can project, and what finding things that are interesting and intellectually interesting and inspiring and morally worth looking up to. And when you don't have a lot of that, it's very hard to project that moving forward. And when there's a real loss of that, it's less of a sense of what's possible to me and what's interesting to me to seek out and to pursue, and one just finds oneself turning inward a little bit, and you know, you have your books in your house and a chair by the window, so to speak, and you kind of pursue things in a private way where you don't expect to go out in the culture and see what's around the corner with some sort of enthusiasm or some enjoyment. And she makes the point about man needing emotional fuel, and then she says, talking about people who are, you know, most people are unable to just by themselves generate and maintain their own emotional fuel, hyphen, their love of life, hyphen. And it's like that idea about emotional fuel having to do with their love of life and experiencing pleasure in the kinds of things that one experiences in the culture. It's like that gradual, I think that's an important point, the gradual loss of pleasure that one experiences in life, or whether it's you're watching TV or you're listening to music or it's the daily grind, and it's where are you to look for something else?
Yeah, and in this context, it's particularly the conceptual, intellectual pleasures that is the focus. So it's a demanding pleasure. It's that in the way that she thought the reader of her novels has to live up to the novels. And you get that same kind of imagery in The Fountainhead of people living up to Rourke's, the houses that he designs, or the buildings and structures. They have to be worthy of it. So it's that kind of phenomenon of you being worthy and finding real deep intellectual enjoyment and stimulation. That's the conceptual deprivation, and you don't get that from the culture. So it's not, as you were saying, it's not like there's no new music, but of this level, in this category of discussion or of art, I think there is actually precious little in the world today.
And I think that's one of the reasons why people who step outside of academia and they go on YouTube, you know, the intellectual dark web people and so on, the people that are outside the general cultural mainstream of what people are getting in colleges and so on, but they're talking about things that and raising the level of intellectual discussion about these things, and they're all of a sudden they're YouTube like superstars. I think again that's another gasping for air kind of issue where you realize, yeah, I don't get that level of discussion in my university classes, and I don't hear it on the news, and I don't know, my friends don't talk like that, or discussion like that are actively discouraged and so on. And here's a sense where this is interesting, and I can follow, and people are just joining on the podcasts, and it's another form of, I'm being asphyxiated and I didn't know it.
Yeah, and so if we transition into this point about, she looks at certain aspects of the culture and if they're, how similar or different is today to what she's bringing up. She brings up the two fields where you would look for meaning, for guidance, philosophy and religion, and thinks both have collapsed. And then she looks at the world of politics and finds it depressing and valueless, like amoral in a certain sense. And then she looks at the field of art and various of the arts. I think there's other things you would look at in terms of a culture to be thinking about, and particularly if you have the wider focus that she says she's narrowing from, which is the issue of sort of the conceptual level of the culture. And is it demanding? And is it demanding of someone that he really exercise and engage his mind, his rational faculties, reason, or not? And then the narrower focus is particularly on the issue of values, and philosophy, religion, politics, art are all value-laden fields that she's looking at. And it's if you take those, sort of the first three, philosophy, religion, politics, it's not obvious that they're that different. I think philosophy is better than it was in the 60s, and we can talk a bit about that. Well, I don't think significantly better. Religion, I mean, if you just think of the Catholic scandal, I mean, the divorce, they're scandalous to sort of nicer term for what the Catholic predatory behavior that's systematic in the church and so on. Or if you think of Islam and its status today as a crusading, politically active, and even in its leading political guises, totalitarian, it's things don't look better in regard to religion. And in politics, particularly if you think of it as now we're cultural value deprivation, I've written about this. I think Trump is the most amoral president we've ever had by far. The total unconcern with moral issues, moral values. So if you just take those three, and we can talk a little more about the philosophy aspect of it, it's not obvious to me that things are better now. And the sort of the whole context for Ford Hall Forum talks that I think one has to get. The first talk is the intellectual bankruptcy of our age, not of 1961, but it's the intellectual bankruptcy, right? And I think she thinks of that as a long-term phenomenon, that it's not, oh, that can change in 3 years, that we're no longer intellectually bankrupt. That this is, as our leading voices in the culture, that we've reached a point of bankruptcy. And I think in some ways we've climbed out a little bit, but that essentially at an intellectual level, intellectual philosophical level, we're still in a period of bankruptcy.
Yeah, in that too is if you start to think about like the state of today's culture versus the 60s, and are we still in that age? And like the question is, where would you look then? So if you look at philosophy, like you said, it's some aspects of this are better, but it's probably not fundamentally changed. Because if it's changing, what does fundamental change look like when it comes to things in philosophy? You would expect to see, I think, partly a wider range of thought, and I think importantly also, well, there are institutional difficulties to the field, and I think there may be a relationship between the institutional features and what's going on in philosophy. That as philosophy started to collapse, it turned in on itself in a way which institutionally now, to get a job, to continue in the job, you have to write highly specialized articles for other specialists. I mean, in general. And the idea of public philosophy, like actually engaging with issues in the culture, being like a public intellectual, is a little looked down on, or at least not taken as very seriously. I think that would have to come back. I think that philosophers would have to be regarded in general. Like when you go to college and take a philosophy course, it's like I need to learn how to have a systematic kind of integrated worldview, and this is going to help me out. And you should have some evidence to think that that's true coming in. Like you see people actually engaging in the culture, helping people get clarity on what's going on and how to organize their lives. And at some point, I think philosophy has to come to terms with that. But then in order to come to terms with that, they have to see themselves as relevant. And as really having some value to offer. And I think a lot of them don't feel that or think about their profession that way. I mean, some certainly do, but I don't think it's the norm.
Yeah, and if you think of some of the people reacting to the state of philosophy in the 60s, so this is a Time magazine article that basically says that philosophers of any of the dominant schools today, whether it's the analyst or the linguistic, with the linguistic analyst or the logical positivist or the existentialist, they don't have anything to say, particularly positive. They don't have things to say. They're not system builders anymore. And there's other people than just Ayn Rand who react to this. And if you think within the profession, two of the people reacting to it who are fairly well known, I would think, so Peter Singer and John Rawls. I would think John Rawls is probably the most well-known philosopher of the past 50 years. Yeah. To the extent someone's heard a name in philosophy, I would think it's Rawls. They're both reacting to this, and in particular reacting to the death of political moral philosophy, that no one has anything to say. They don't think philosophers can offer advice about values, and that's in the timepiece too, that we've got nothing to say about values. And Ayn Rand quotes that, like, live with it, we've got nothing to do, live with it. I think that's in essence what the chair of the UCLA department is saying, and that's what she quotes from the article. They're trying to bring back political philosophy, moral political philosophy, that there's an emphasis on values, a connection to the real world. Both Singer is trying to deal with real world cases and say, like, it matters what you think about this, global famines, and Rawls in terms of the whole political structure, and he's trying to be systematic, at least in regard to politics, though it's detached from deeper metaphysical, epistemological issues and sort of deliberately detached. You can argue if it really is. I don't think any work in political philosophy really is detached from metaphysics and epistemology, but it's trying to bracket those. But within at least political philosophy, it could be systematic. But if you think of the content, and I think for sure this is Ayn Rand's perspective with regard to Rawls, because she writes a little bit about Rawls. It's a recycling of doctrines of the past with nothing new. I mean, one of her, you don't need to write a 700-page book, A New Theory of Justice, to say what Rawls is saying, because it's essentially the egalitarianism is altruism stripped of all its veneer. And there's a way you could see Singer is doing the same thing. It's altruism stripped of all its veneer. It's part of the traditions, sort of moral tradition. So there's not something new there. That is, it's not new thinking. It's a rehash, and so there's a perspective you can think is better because it's engaging now more with real issues and so on. But it's not. If philosophy and philosophers are supposed to be radical and willing to question things down to the root, and so on, that's not happening. If you just take those two figures, and I think that, in terms of thinking about the field, that's part of what one has to, how willing is it, and particularly for philosophy, is it willing to go to the roots of things and question and say, maybe this is all wrong in a deep, fundamental way. And I think there's some of that has gone on, but not nearly enough. If you've reached a real stage of bankruptcy, that it seems like you have by the 60s, if you've got leading philosophers saying, like, we've got nothing to offer, basically. If that's not a stage of bankruptcy, what is? And you really have to rethink if you reach that stage.
And she says in the talk that the culture is nihilistic, like the art is nihilistic. It's about distortion, or worse, blobs. And part of that is, what are the positive values being championed? And like, you just think about politics. I mean, what are the positive values that people can really rally about? And there's some aspects of it, but it seems like So she said the morality and cynicism is a dangerous mix, or something like that. And it's you get a lot of calls about here are the values we should rally behind, but that makes me think of like the intellectual bankruptcy of our age, or the beginning of the new intellectual, where but there's such stale platitudes, and nobody even believes them anyway, and nobody believes the politicians' advocacy of them. So you get a kind of crusading morality that nobody buys, and it makes you cynical about politics and about morality, and but what are they really championing? And it's like, I don't think it's really anything positive on either way. And I've been out of the academic world, but I don't know, and it'd be an interesting thing to follow up. Like people who have spent more time in academia, I was only there for a number of years, but what are looking across the field in ethics, in epistemology, in political philosophy, what are the positive values that are really are there trends in the field where it looks like these things are starting to become more center stage, more important in the field, in the profession, their value is being recognized? I mean, that would be interesting to look into as well. I mean, there are certain, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, that's something to look into, and in general, these kind of fields where are they offering real values, and you can actually a discernible trend in the culture, because there's always someone who's saying something better, but to look at it as a cultural trend, like we're moving out of this.
Yeah,
these are the kind of things.
Probably should see. I mean, we have a low attendance for this. I think there was glitches in people getting notification about reminders about the webinar going on. But just see if there's questions, and there's a couple more points I want to make, but that's it, and then for sure we can open it up for more general questions. But any questions so far about what we've been discussing? And we can wait see if we get some. I want to make a point about, I said that if you're thinking about the culture widely, not just from the perspective of values, there's other things you would think about, and that would be relevant for assessing their current state versus other times, other places, and thinking about that. And it's two things that two aspects that she's very focused on. And even in the Fort Hall Forum talk, so it's the intellectual bankruptcy of our age is the first one, and then America's persecuted minority, big business is the second one. So there's no discussion of the realm of, or very little, of the realm of business and economics more generally in this, our cultural value deprivation in this talk. And I think this is part of what the narrowing is when she says, I'm narrowing to the issues about values and the value deprivation that we live in, and particularly of significant moral values, that there's a real absence in the culture. You would think about the world of business and economics if you're looking at this wider of the issue of, do we still live in a world or an era of conceptual deprivation? That would be one of the things. But then science and technology, which obviously she's so much on the side of, I mean, that's the flip side of the anti-industrial revolution, is she's pro-industrialization, pro-science, pro-technology. It's the same in regard to the moon landing. So both of those fields, you would have to think what is going on, and particularly what is going on that's having cultural impact. And I would put both of those as better than in the late 60s. And they're responsible, I think, more than anything else for the fact, because I do think the culture today, in a certain sense, is better than it was in the 60s, late 60s, 70s. I think of that as the worst period in American history, particularly the 70s. It's sort of the aftermath of all this. It's awful in all kinds of ways, including the whole flight from the cities. But people really thought in the 70s that maybe America's collapsing, its best days are behind it. And then if you look into the whole age of the internet, you wouldn't think from our perspective today, our best days are behind us. They might be politically, but not totally. And in significant ways, life is so much better now. And in both of these realms, so the realm of business, the realm of science and technology, they demand conceptual functioning. And I think more so now than they did. There was, in the late 60s, it's the era of these big conglomerate businesses, in part protected by various kinds of government controls. So they're hard to break up, they're hard to compete with. people thought of, I go to one company and then I'm sort of set for life and I don't have to think too much about my career and so on. And if you think today how people think about their careers, I think it's much more active-minded. Now, not for everyone, but the culture encourages it, I think. And if you think of Silicon Valley, and if you go back to this issue of what is possible to me, part of what people talk about is the atmosphere of Silicon Valley, and which I think is real, is that everything's possible here. Now, that doesn't mean everything possible culturally, in the sense, though I think many in Silicon Valley think they can fix every problem. So we could fix politics and we could fix morality, which I do not think is the case. But within the realm of business, science, technology, and the application of technology to real world problems, I think there is that atmosphere that everything is possible. We're at a new dawn. And that is, that's so enormously positive as in terms of a culture. And again, thinking, is it encouraging people to think, or is it encouraging people to give up, to evade, to either just drift in lethargy or just actively not want to see things? And it's such an enormous positive, I think, today, that if you're thinking at the broader issue of it, conceptual deprivation or not, those aspects are dramatically better.
I think it's also one of the reasons why defending, what is going on in Silicon Valley in terms of the technology and the innovations and the entrepreneurship is so important. Because my first thought about this was like, where in today's culture can you look for something that's like really exciting and inspiring, and it's essentially technology, and it's the only place where you have like a real feeling like we have an open horizon and we want the best minds. And the best minds, only the best minds need apply. And people move. They move from Microsoft and they move to some other company. They go to Amazon, and just people are moving around. There's a constant sense like you have to keep growing and building, and anything's possible. And it's almost like technology. The image of Silicon Valley is like taking the place of art, and the fact of projecting like what is possible. And I don't really know where else you'd find that in the culture. And and if you imagine it without Silicon Valley. That absent, I think you have a dead culture. I mean, no one else is carrying that sort of beacon in a way.
And people respond in that way, in the way that they're looking forward to. They tune in from work to Apple's announcements of its latest products or what Google is doing. So there's that kind of eager anticipation that's a cultural phenomenon. It's not just the people living in Silicon Valley or something like that. And it is, I think it's hard to understate its importance. And there's many times that I disagree with fellow objectivists about the way they process certain things about the culture. And this is one of them. The issue of that people in Silicon Valley tend towards Democrats and voting Democrat. Even if that were a problem, and I don't actually think in today's world Republicans are better than Democrats, but it's such a superficial aspect of looking at what is the essence of Silicon Valley. What are the people there like? Why are they going there? What are they attracted by? Are they attracted by that everybody votes Democrat? Are they attracted by the limitless possibility in terms of technology and business? And then what impact does it have on the culture? It's one of the, if not the major thing that's lifting us up. And in that context, to have criticisms of it without understanding that that's the essence of the phenomenon, I think you're just undercutting something that is so enormously good and positive.
It reminds me of in Atlas Shrugged, with everybody, the push to people moving into Colorado, like in the novel. It was that sense that anything's possible here, and all the best businesses are moving there.
I think that's a good parallel in the fiction, because it is that same atmosphere.
Yeah. And personal lessons?
I think this, one of the reasons this Ford Hall Forum talk, I think is very interesting, very philosophical. And for Ayn Rand, the philosophical is the personal. You should always be thinking about philosophical issues, primarily from the perspective of what does it have to do with my life? What impact does it have on my life? And some of the Fort Hall Forum's talks are more political analysis of elections or of phenomena related to the political state of the world. And I think for them, there are also personal lessons to draw. But this one, because it's philosophical, moral focus, I think it's more immediate and apparent what one of the lessons is. And I think of, I mean, we've touched on this, but I think one of the crucial points is you're in an environment that is, you're deprived of values, and you might not know it. And you need to recognize, I mean, the first step in addressing a problem is to recognize that you have a problem. And she's really emphasizing that you live in a state and a current culture that deprives you of real, deep, moral, intellectual values. And one of the lessons should be, I need to actively seek them out. They're not going to be given to me.
Yeah.
The culture's not, it's pushing me in the opposite direction. And I need to not be pushed around like that, but assert myself, and particularly assert myself in the realm of values and to seek these out. So we touched on that the 19th century was very different, or ancient Athens was very different. And you can't live in those, but you can get many of the products. I mean, too few for ancient Greece, a lot have been lost, but you can get many of the products that existed then, and you can enjoy them now, from literature to music, to even sort of some more popular type stories. I mean, Ayn Rand, people are always surprised by this, that her favorite novel is Calumet K, which is like a serialized popular fiction at the turn of the century America. But I think part of what she likes so much about it is it's not explicitly intellectual, but what it does is it takes you back a little bit. It gives you some flavor for what America at the turn of the century was like, and what people's concerns were and weren't. And it's and the lead character is enormously purposeful and action oriented, and so I can get, when I read that, why she liked it so much, because this is so unlike today's world. And so you can get some of that. It doesn't only have to be sort of the high literature, the timeless stuff. Get some of the stuff that's in one way more dated, but it gives you a flavor for what things were like in that time period. And there's many things you can do like that. And because, to go back to the issue of Silicon Valley and something like the whole technological revolution, the internet revolution, so much of that is so more easily accessible. I mean, when you think of what technology has made possible, I mean, you're driving around back roads of America in a snowstorm, and you can be listening to Brahms in stereo in the car. People couldn't imagine that 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And so it is, relatively speaking, easy to access many of these things, but you have to be active about it, and you have to be purposeful, and you have to realize why there's a real need to do this, because your culture's pushing you in a very different direction. And I think when I grasp it, that's part of what she was pushing people to do. And this comes out in the Romantic Manifesto and in the introduction as well. I sought out all kinds of things then in college that weren't part of my classes and so on. And you're so much the richer for doing that. But you have to do it after.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same thought about one of the takeaways has to be, you have to take an active role in actually finding these things. And if you haven't read the book Calumet K, and I think read it, Particularly because if you want some site, like she said, it's hard to communicate what the atmosphere was like earlier and how different it was. That is one of the best ways to get at communicating that and experiencing it, and particularly not looking at high literature. That you don't look at the mountaintops to try to get a sense of what the general culture was like, but this was released serially in like the newspaper or in a magazine or something like that, and it's yeah, and I think it's wonderful from that perspective. I think you can really see why she responds to that. But so when you mentioned, Onkar, that there's a lot actually out there and it's available to, whether it's literature from ancient Greece, or from the 19th century. Is it always looking back? Because I mean, I tend to do the same thing as I listen to music from from people long dead, and that's where I get important values. And I listen to music all the time. Like I can't function without it.
I think it's.
What about looking around now?
I think it's mostly looking back, but that you should actively be looking for things in today's culture as well. I mean, one of the things that I like about sort of Ayn Rand's attitude, or at least what you can glean from it, I mean, I didn't know her, but what you can glean from it, from her writings, is her champion of Capitalism, a painter. And she doesn't need the establishment or whatever to tell her, oh, this is a great painter, so you guys should go to the exhibits and so on. She has her own standards, her own judgment, like Rourke in that regard. But when she sees something in contemporary culture that she recognizes, now I don't think she thought of him as a trend in contemporary culture or something, but still, she thought of him as a great artist, I think, that she actively seeks that out, champions it. She writes an article about it. And I think to the extent you should be out on the lookout for those kinds of things. And when you do find them in this culture, especially, it's important to acknowledge, to champion it, to point out that this isn't the typical smears on canvas that somehow becomes art because someone hung it in a museum. Even if he's neglected or what have you, you have your own independent perspective and standards on this. So I think one should be on the lookout for these kinds of things, but unfortunately, most of what you're going to find is going to be from the past and not the present. But so I always found that, like, I like that Ayn Rand is so forward-looking and she's so pro-progress, science, technology, that she wants to find things in contemporary culture, and even like a Mickey Spillane, that people make fun of her, but it's not high literature, but you can see some of the values that she's responding to, and when she sees that again, she became, not just she reads them, but she recommended him, and that, I think you need to be doing that in your existing culture where you can, but she didn't think he's Hugo or anything like Hugo. But it's still relevant to pay attention to.
And just as an aside, if you haven't had or don't own or haven't looked at the letters of Ayn Rand, there's a very charming correspondence back and forth between her and Mickey Spillane, both as writers, like both as fiction writers back and forth, thinking about each other's work and talking about that, but just as friends, and that is very, very benevolent kind of interaction. And also what makes it possible, especially more easily nowadays, is that I think when people discover something, interesting, it's easier to share it. And I think there's a lot of that kind of going on, which is made easier, but it's, just share it if you find it,
And if you, again, it is true that much of it is in the past, but on the other hand, the modern world and modern technology has made it accessible in a way, like like even late 19th century, how many people would see Vermeers? The original Vermeer, it's not easy to go, there's 30 or 30 some in existence. If you can't afford to go to the few museums that have them, so you wouldn't see it.
ever.
Now with how easy travel is and how global a world is, so many things are accessible to a vastly greater population than ever before. Again, you have to do things to go seek them out, but you can do it for relatively inexpensively, relatively low cost in a way you couldn't do that before. And it's not to be sort of, oh, well, yeah, that's not a big deal. I think it's a huge deal that this is what technology has enabled. It's given people leisure time in a way that they've never had before. That so you have time to enjoy these kinds of things if you make the effort. And part of the lesson, I think, of this talk is it's worth making the effort.
Yeah, and supporting those features in the culture that are better, so that they don't just get stifled as well.
Yeah. Okay, so how about anyone with questions? Otherwise, we can wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe just a reminder then again. So the next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, same time, so 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. We'll be talking about Ayn Rand's Fort Hall Forum talk, The Nation's Unity, and it will be, I'll be talking about that along with Ben Bayer.
Great, thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks guys, bye.